Please don't go. I can't do this alone.
Rain battered the rusted zinc roof of Grace Lawson's one-room apartment in Mushin with the kind of force that made the whole place tremble. Water dripped through one corner into a blue plastic bowl she had placed there days earlier, but tonight she barely noticed it. She was bent over the side of her narrow bed, one hand clutching her swollen stomach, the other gripping the mattress so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Another contraction tore through her. Grace cried out and sank to her knees on the thin wrapper spread across the floor. Her breath came in frightened bursts. The room around her was dim, lit only by a weak, rechargeable lamp that threw tired shadows against the cracked wall. On the small table near the window sat a half-packed hospital bag, a Bible, and a framed photo of her late father turned face down months ago in anger and grief. She had told herself she was ready for this moment. She had read articles, watched videos, counted weeks, folded baby clothes, and prayed more prayers than she could remember. But nothing had prepared her for the terror of labor arriving in the middle of a storm alone. Her phone lay on the bed beside her. She reached for it with trembling fingers and dialed Ethan Cole. It rang once, twice, 3 times. By the time he answered, Grace was already crying. "Ethan," she whispered, fighting for breath. "Please, it's time." There was a pause on the line, the faint hum of a car engine behind his voice. "Are you sure?" A sharp pain seized her again, stealing her words. She gasped, pressed her forehead against the bed frame, and managed, "Please come. Please." He exhaled heavily, as if burdened by an inconvenience. "I'm on my way." Those 4 words should have brought comfort. Instead, they landed in her chest with uncertainty. 20 minutes later, the headlights of Ethan's black SUV cut through the rain outside her building. Grace had already struggled into her loose maternity gown, tied a scarf over her hair, and dragged her bag to the door. When he entered, expensive cologne and cold air came in with him. He looked polished as always, even in the storm. Clean beard, crisp shirt, watch glinting under the weak light. But his face carried none of the urgency hers did. He glanced around the room, then at her. "Let's go?" No embrace, no hand on her shoulder, no whispered reassurance. Grace swallowed the hurt. There was no time for pride now. The ride from Mushin to Yaba General Hospital felt endless. Rain streaked across the windows in silver lines, while traffic lights reflected in pools of muddy water. Grace gripped the door handle with one hand and her belly with the other, breathing through wave after wave of pain. Ethan drove in silence, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the road. "Say something," Grace whispered at last, her voice fragile. He did not look at her. "What do you want me to say?" She turned slowly toward him, wounded already by more than labor. "Tell me I'm not alone." For a second, something flickered in Ethan's expression. Fear, guilt, maybe even shame, but it vanished as quickly as it came. When they pulled into the hospital compound, thunder rolled across the Lago sky. Ethan came around to open her door and helped her out, as another contraction bent her double. Grace clung to his arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. Inside the bright maternity reception, nurses rushed forward with a wheelchair. Grace reached for Ethan's hand, desperate now, stripped of every defense. "Please don't leave me," she said, her eyes shining with tears. "Not tonight. Please." Ethan glanced toward the entrance, then back at her, as if calculating something invisible and terrible. "I need to handle something urgent. I'll be back." Grace stared at him, not fully understanding. "Ethan." But the nurse was already wheeling her away. Over her shoulder, through the blur of pain, fluorescent light, and rain-soaked glass doors, she saw him standing there for one suspended moment. Then he turned and walked out into the storm. The maternity ward smelled of antiseptic, metal, and fear. Grace Lawson was barely aware of the corridor lights rushing above her as the nurses pushed her deeper into the ward. Pain came in waves so fierce that the world seemed to split around them. One moment she could hear voices clearly, orders, footsteps, the squeak of rubber soles against tiled floor, and the next, everything disappeared beneath the force tearing through her body. "Breathe, madam, breathe!" Nurse Beesy's voice broke through the chaos like a rope thrown into deep water. She was a broad-shouldered woman with tired eyes and a calmness Grace clung to without even knowing her name. "Don't fight it? Save your strength?" Grace nodded weakly, though tears already streamed into her hairline. Her fingers searched blindly for her phone. Ethan still had not called. Between contractions, she turned the screen on. No missed calls, no messages, no explanation. Only silence. That silence hurt more than she wanted to admit. It spread through her like cold water, settling into places labor could not reach. She told herself he would come back before the baby arrived. She told herself he had only stepped out. She told herself he would walk through those swinging ward doors and say he was sorry, say traffic delayed him. Say anything that would make sense of the hollow fear growing inside her. Another contraction ripped through her before hope could finish forming. Hours seemed to lose shape. Grace screamed, sweated, cried, prayed. At one point, she called out Ethan's name so loudly that the woman in the next bed turned her face to the wall in quiet pity. Nurse Beesy wiped Grace's forehead with a damp cloth and kept saying the same words, steady and unshaking. "You can do this. Push. You can do this." But every time Grace pushed, she felt she was bringing her daughter into a world where disappointment had already arrived before birth. Near dawn, rain still tapped lightly against the glass panes when the final pain came like fire. Grace let out a cry so raw it seemed to tear from somewhere deeper than her body. Then, all at once, another sound filled the room. A baby's cry. Thin at first, then strong. The nurse lifted the tiny child, wrapped in a hospital cloth, and for one suspended second, Grace forgot every hurt she had known. Her chest shook as she stared at the small face, the tightly shut eyes, the wet curls pressed to a delicate skull. The baby's mouth opened again in protest at the cold world, and Grace burst into exhausted tears. "It's a girl," Nurse Beesy said softly, and this time there was something warm in her voice. "A beautiful baby girl." When they laid the child in Grace's arms, everything around her blurred. Machines, curtains, pain, emptiness, fear. None of it vanished completely. But something greater had entered the room. Grace looked down at her daughter and whispered, with cracked lips and trembling breath, "Faith." It was not a random name. It was a confession, a plea, a decision. Because if this child had arrived through abandonment and pain, then faith was the only thing Grace had left to offer her. The sun had barely risen when a hospital attendant brought the admission and birth forms. Grace shifted weakly against the pillow as baby Faith slept beside her in the cot. Her body ached in places she had never known could hurt. Her eyelids were heavy, her lips were dry. But it was the sight of one section on the paper that froze her hand. Father's name. The pen hovered. Grace stared at the line for a long time. She could still see Ethan at the ward entrance. Still hear him saying, "I'll be back." Still feel the warmth of his sleeve beneath her desperate grip before he walked away into the rain. The memory sat before her like a second document, unsigned and cruel. "Madam?" the attendant asked gently. Grace blinked fast. The paper had gone blurry. Slowly she wrote her own name where she could. Her fingers trembled when she reached the space meant for the father. For one terrible second, she considered filling it anyway, as if writing Ethan's name would force him into responsibility. But truth, even when painful, was still truth. She lowered the pen. When Nurse Beasy came back later, Grace asked in a hoarse voice, "Has anyone asked for me?" The nurse hesitated just long enough to answer honestly. No. That single word settled over the room like dust. Toward midday, while Faith slept with one tiny fist near her cheek, Grace reached for her phone again. She had not wanted to look. A part of her had been afraid to know, but another part could no longer bear not knowing. She opened social media, and there he was, Ethan Cole, freshly dressed, perfectly groomed, smiling faintly at a private dining table in Ikoyi. Beside him sat Margaret Cole in silk and diamonds, regal and unbothered, and across from them was Vanessa Hart, elegant in cream, holding a wineglass with polished fingers. The caption beneath the photo was simple, heartless, and devastating in its normalcy. Family first. Grace stared at the screen until her vision doubled. She looked from the glowing image to the tiny sleeping baby beside her. And in that moment, something inside her broke so quietly, no one else in the room heard it. Not with drama, not with shouting, not even with anger. Just the final, unbearable understanding that, while she had been fighting to bring their child into the world, Ethan had chosen another table, another loyalty, another life. Grace turned the phone face down. Then she drew baby Faith closer, pressed trembling lips to her forehead, and wept without sound. Grace was discharged 2 days later under a pale Lagos sky that looked scrubbed clean by the storm, as if the city had no memory of what had happened beneath its rain. But Grace remembered every second. She remembered the pain, the silence, the empty doorway, and the photograph on her phone, the line left blank on the hospital form. She carried all of it with her as she stepped out of Yaba General Hospital, with baby Faith wrapped against her chest and a small bag hanging from her shoulder. No one came to receive her. No black SUV. No flowers. No apology. Only the sharp morning air, the growl of buses on the road, and the ache in her body that reminded her every few steps that she had brought life into the world without the hand she thought would hold hers. The taxi ride back to Mushin was slow and uncomfortable. Faith slept through most of it, her tiny face soft and unaware, while Grace leaned back against the worn seat and watched Lagos move past the window in restless layers. Yellow buses, roadside hawkers, puddles catching sunlight, men arguing over fares, women balancing trays on their heads as if the weight of the world could be carried with practiced grace. When the taxi stopped in front of her building, Grace stared at the narrow staircase for a long moment. Climbing it now felt like scaling a mountain. Inside, her one-room apartment seemed even smaller than before. The damp smell of the walls greeted her first, then the sight of the bed pressed against one corner, the plastic chair near the window, the old standing fan, the basin beneath the leak in the roof, and the tiny pile of baby clothes she had washed by hand before labor began. It was the same room, but Grace was no longer the same woman who had left it. She placed Faith gently on the bed and stood still for a moment, one hand pressed to her lower back. The room was silent except for the distant noise of traffic and the occasional cry of a child from another compound. There should have been joy in that silence. A new mother bringing her baby home, a beginning, a family. Instead, the room felt like witness. Grace unpacked slowly. She folded the hospital wrapper, arranged the diapers, set the small bottles Lydia had bought before labor near the wall. Then she sat down carefully on the edge of the bed and looked at her daughter. Faith opened her eyes. They were dark and curious, too young to focus, Yet Grace felt as if the child were already asking a question. What now? Grace swallowed hard. What now, indeed? The answer came faster than she was ready for. By evening, the landlord knocked on her door. He stood outside in a singlet and rubber slippers, clearing his throat with the stiffness of a man pretending inconvenience was business. Grace, he said, lowering his voice when he noticed the baby. I've tried to be patient. The rent matter. Grace tightened her wrapper around herself. I just got back from the hospital. I know. He shifted, embarrassed but determined. But I also have obligations. Just tell me when. She wanted to say she did not know. Wanted to ask him if childbirth came with a grace period in the city, if pain could be converted into currency, if betrayal could pay bills. But she only nodded and said quietly, soon. After he left, she shut the door and leaned against it, holding back tears. That night was her first true night alone with Faith. It began with courage and ended in exhaustion. The baby cried every hour. Grace struggled to sit up, to feed her, to check her wrapper, to rock her with aching arms while her own stitches burned and her head throbbed. The power went out just before midnight, plunging the room into darkness and heat. Mosquitoes sang in the corners. Sweat gathered at the back of Grace's neck. Faith cried harder. Somewhere outside, music played from a distant bar, as if joy and suffering rented rooms in the same street. At some point after 1 a.m, Grace sat on the bed with her baby against her chest and began to cry. Not the deep, shattering sobs from the hospital. This was quieter, steadier, more dangerous. The cry of a woman realizing that survival would not come in one grand decision, but in hundreds of tiny humiliations no one would applaud. Warming water without electricity, stretching money, hiding fear, staying awake, healing while mothering, becoming both parents in a city that barely made room for one. A soft knock came at the door the next afternoon. It was Lydia. She entered carrying a nylon bag full of groceries, baby wipes, sachet water, bread, and one small container of pepper soup balanced carefully on top. Her face, usually bright with sarcasm and quick laughter, changed the moment she saw Grace properly. "Geez," Lydia whispered. "You look like you've been fighting a war." Grace let out a weak laugh that almost became a sob. Lydia set everything down immediately and pulled her into the gentlest embrace her healing body could manage. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry." Grace stood still in her friend's arms for a second, before the tears came again, warm and humiliating and unstoppable. Lydia held her through them without rushing her, without offering foolish comfort. When Grace finally sat down, Lydia moved around the room with quiet efficiency, washing cups, reheating food, changing Faith's cloth, opening the window for air. Later, when Grace had eaten a little and Faith was asleep, Lydia sat opposite her on the plastic chair and folded her hands. "Listen to me carefully," she said. Grace looked up. "You need to stop hoping that shame will make Ethan become a different man. Men like that don't wake up because your heart is broken. They wake up when consequences start breathing down their neck." Grace stared at her. "I'm not telling you to fight dirty," Lydia continued. "I'm telling you to be wise. Keep every message, every missed call, every promise he made, every transfer, every excuse. Write dates, save screenshots. Don't throw away anything." Grace frowned faintly. "Why?" "Because memory is emotional," Lydia said. "But evidence is stubborn." The words settled into the room with weight. Grace glanced at her phone lying beside the pillow. Ethan had still not come, still not explained, still not asked properly about his daughter. There had only been one brief message that morning. "Hope you and the baby are fine. We'll talk soon. No apology. No responsibility. No soul." Grace reached for an old notebook from the table near the window. It had once held household expenses and prayer points. She opened to a fresh page, uncapped a pen, and stared at the blank lines. Then slowly she began to write. Date baby was born. Time Ethan left. Number of missed calls. Screenshot of post. Hospital discharge day. Landlord visit. Message received. Her handwriting shook at first, then steadied. Faith stirred in her sleep and let out a small cry. Grace rose carefully, lifted her daughter, and held her close. She looked around the room, the cracked wall, the weak fan, the patched curtain, the friend washing plates in the corner, and something subtle changed inside her. She was still wounded, still tired, and still frightened. But helplessness was beginning to lose its grip, because if no one was coming to rescue her, then this tiny room in Mushin would become the place where she learned to rescue herself. Ethan Cole returned on a Tuesday afternoon, as if abandonment could be rearranged into something neat and reasonable if it arrived in daylight. The sun hung low over Mushin, baking the corrugated roofs and sending waves of heat through the narrow compound. Grace had just finished bathing baby Faith with water warmed on a kerosene stove. The child lay on the bed in a faded pink wrapper, blinking sleepily while Grace folded the last dry cloth. Her body still ached in quiet places. Her nights were still broken, but her hands had started to learn a rhythm. Carry, clean, feed, record, breathe, repeat. When the knock came, she assumed it was Lydia. She opened the door and froze. Ethan stood there in a crisp navy shirt, dark sunglasses in one hand, car keys in the other, looking as though he had stepped out of a boardroom and accidentally found himself in the wrong part of Lagos. The familiar scent of expensive cologne entered before his words did. For one suspended moment, Grace was not in her room anymore. She was back under the hospital lights, back at the ward entrance, back in the rain with her hand on his sleeve and fear in her throat. Then Faith made a small sound from the bed and the spell broke. "Can I come in?" Ethan asked. Grace did not answer immediately. She simply stepped aside. He entered and looked around with the discomfort of a man who remembered too late that other people lived real lives outside the air-conditioned places he moved through. His gaze brushed the narrow bed, the small fridge in the corner, the bowl catching a leak under the ceiling stain, and the sleeping baby. For the first time since he walked away, Grace saw something close to uncertainty in him. She's small," he said. Grace folded her arms loosely across herself. "Babies usually are." His jaw tightened slightly at the dryness in her voice. "I've been busy." The sentence hung in the room like a bad smell. Grace said nothing. Ethan turned toward her fully. "That night got complicated." "Complicated?" she repeated softly. "Yes." He rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding her eyes for a moment. "My mother was involved. There were issues at home. Vanessa was there. A lot was happening. I didn't handle it well." Grace stared at him. It was astonishing how ordinary his tone sounded, how calm, as if he were explaining a missed meeting instead of the worst night of her life. He took a step closer. "But I'm here now. That's what matters." Something in Grace's face changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for Ethan to realize, too late, that the woman before him was not the same one who had begged him not to leave her. "Is it?" she asked. Ethan glanced at the baby again, then reached into his pocket and brought out an envelope. "There's money in here, for the baby, for anything you need. I'll make sure you're taken care of." Grace looked at the envelope but did not move. "I also think it's important," he continued, taking confidence from his own voice, "that we handle this quietly. There's no need for people to start talking. We can sort out the documents, put my surname where it should be, and keep things under control." Grace let the silence grow. Ethan mistook it for consideration. "I know you're upset," he said, softer now. "But let's be mature about this." That was when Grace lifted her eyes and looked directly into his. "Where were you?" The question was calm, barely above a whisper. Yet it landed with the force of a slap. Ethan blinked. "Grace." "No," she said. "Answer me properly. Not with money, not with a family image, not with your mother, not with Vanessa. Where were you when I was screaming in labor and calling your phone?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. Grace stepped closer. "Where were you when they asked for the father's name on the form?" she continued. "Where were you when I could not stand up from that hospital bed without feeling like my body had been torn open? Where were you when I saw your picture online, smiling over dinner while I was lying there alone with your child?" Ethan's face darkened with discomfort. "You're making this bigger than—" "Bigger than what?" Grace's voice rose for the first time, not in chaos but in disbelief. "Bigger than abandonment? Bigger than cowardice? Bigger than choosing your comfort while I was bleeding?" Faith stirred and whimpered. Grace turned immediately, lifting the baby with practiced tenderness, pressing her against her shoulder until the child settled again. When she faced Ethan once more, the contrast between her gentleness with the baby and the steel in her eyes unsettled him. "I came to fix things," he said, defensive now. "You don't have to make me the villain." Grace almost laughed, but there was no joy in it. "You made yourself that the night you walked away." He held up the envelope. "At least take this." She shook her head. "It's not charity," he snapped. "It's responsibility." "Responsibility would have stayed," Grace replied. The words struck home because Ethan flinched. For the first time, he looked less like a polished Lagos heir and more like what he truly was. A man seeing the outline of his own failure and not liking the shape of it. He lowered the envelope slowly. "What do you want from me?" Grace shifted Faith in her arms and answered with a steadiness that startled even her. "Nothing you can give me now will change what you already chose." He stared at her, and in that moment he understood two things at once. First, that he had lost the power to define the story. Second, that the woman in front of him was already beginning to move beyond his reach. His expression hardened to protect what was left of his pride. "So that's it?" he asked. "You'll shut me out?" Grace looked down at her daughter, then back at him. "You shut yourself out." Another silence stretched between them, heavier than the room could hold. At last, Ethan placed the envelope on the small table by the window as though leaving money behind might soften the failure of leaving himself behind again. He adjusted his cuff, picked up his sunglasses, and moved toward the door. At the threshold, he paused, perhaps expecting her to call him back. She did not. He left without another word. The sound of his car starting outside drifted faintly through the heat. Grace stood still until it faded completely. Then she sat on the edge of the bed, Faith in her arm, and looked at the envelope on the table, as if it were some foreign object washed ashore after a storm. After a long moment, she reached for her notebook. She wrote the date, the time, the words he used. The envelope he left behind, the request to keep things quiet, the mention of his surname, the absence of apology. When she finished, she underlined one sentence so firmly the pen almost tore the page. Responsibility would have stayed. Faith opened her eyes and looked up at her mother. Grace bent and kissed her forehead. The room was still small, the roof still leaked, the bills were still waiting. But as the afternoon light shifted across the cracked wall, Grace felt something settling into place inside her. Not peace, not yet, but clarity. and sometimes clarity was the first form of power. 3 days after Ethan's visit, Grace was sitting by the window with baby Faith asleep across her lap when the power went out again. The fan slowed, groaned, and stopped. Heat gathered quickly in the room, pressing against the walls like another burden. Grace leaned back in the plastic chair and closed her eyes for a moment. On the table beside her sat the notebook where she had begun recording everything Ethan said and did. The pages were filling. Dates, times, words, silences, excuses. She had not planned for her pain to become evidence, yet somehow that small act of writing had given shape to the chaos. Faith stirred, and Grace gently rocked her. Her eyes fell on the old metal box beneath the bed. It was one of the few things she had carried with her when life fell apart years ago. She had not opened it in months, maybe longer. It held the pieces of a life she had trained herself not to touch. Old papers, photographs, and memories connected to the father she believed had cast her aside before dying without reconciliation. That afternoon, perhaps because the room was too quiet, or because Ethan's return had reopened old wounds about rejection, Grace pulled the box out and set it on the bed. The hinges creaked. Inside were neatly folded documents, a pearl earring without its pair, a church program from years ago, and beneath them, a framed photograph of a younger Grace standing beside Richard Lawson. She could not have been more than 19. He stood tall in a gray suit, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder, his face stern as always, but his eyes softer than she remembered. Grace stared at the photo until her throat tightened. Richard Lawson had been a powerful real estate investor, respected in Lagos, feared in boardrooms, and difficult at home. He had loved order, discipline, and control. Grace had once loved him fiercely. Then she had disappointed him. At least that was how the story had ended in her mind. She chose love where he wanted strategy, tenderness where he wanted caution. And after their final quarrel, he had shut her out so completely that when he died, she buried him in the same place she buried the belief that she had once been truly wanted. Grace ran her thumb over the edge of the frame. "Why did you make it so easy for people to leave me?" she whispered. A knock at the door startled her. She quickly wiped her face and rose to answer it, Faith now drowsing against her shoulder. A man stood outside in the fading afternoon light. He was tall, neatly dressed despite the heat, probably around 40, with the controlled stillness of someone used to entering difficult rooms. He held a leather file close to his side and removed his glasses before speaking. "Grace Lawson?" Her grip tightened around Faith. "Yes. My name is Barrister Daniel Reed," he said gently. "I worked for your father." Grace's breath caught. For a second, the room behind her seemed to tilt. "I've been trying to find you," he continued. "May I come in? What I have to say concerns your late father's final instructions. And your daughter." Grace did not move immediately. Something old and frightened rose in her chest. So did suspicion. People did not appear at your door in Mushin with your dead father's name unless they carried either trouble or truth, sometimes both. At last she stepped aside. Daniel entered, glanced once at the humble room, then at the child in her arms. His expression changed almost imperceptibly, as though some detail had confirmed what he came to see. He did not sit until Grace did. Then, with quiet care, he opened the leather file. "Miss Lawson," he said, "your father never disinherited you." The words were so unexpected that Grace simply stared. Daniel slid a sealed envelope across the table. "Richard Lawson created a protected trust years ago," he said. "Its release conditions were highly specific. One of them was time. Another was your first child." Grace looked from the envelope to his face, unable to speak. For years, Daniel continued, the estate remained untouched because your father believed that if everything was handed to you too early, the wrong people would circle you. He wanted time to test motives. He wanted life to reveal character, harshly perhaps, but deliberately. Grace's fingers trembled as she picked up the envelope. On the front, in her father's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "For Grace, when the truth can no longer be delayed." The room went very still. Faith shifted softly in her arms. Daniel's voice lowered. Your father left you more than money. He left properties, investment holdings, controlling shares, and a legal structure designed to protect you. I came because the final activation clause was met at the birth of your child. Grace looked down at her daughter, then back at the envelope. The father, she thought, had rejected her. The child she had almost brought into despair. The life she thought was finished. All three had somehow converged in one moment. With shaking fingers, Grace broke the seal. Grace unfolded the letter slowly, as though the paper itself might bruise if handled too quickly. For a moment she could not read. Her eyes filled too fast. Her hands were shaking, Faith's small warmth still pressed against her chest. Daniel Reed, seated quietly across from her like a man who understood that some truths had to enter a room softly or not at all. At last, Grace forced her eyes to focus. The handwriting was unmistakably her father's, firm, disciplined, slightly slanted, every word measured as if even emotion had once obeyed his rules. My dear Grace. The first line alone undid her. Not Miss Lawson. Not daughter written stiffly out of duty. Not the cold distance she had trained herself to remember. My dear Grace. A tear slid down her cheek and fell onto the page. She kept reading. Richard Lawson wrote that if she was holding the letter, then life had already taught her what his pride never allowed him to explain properly while he was alive. He admitted that he had been too hard, too controlling, too afraid of losing her to people who would love her only for what surrounded her. He wrote that when she resisted the future he had chosen for her, he reacted not with wisdom, but with wounded pride. Yet even in anger, he had not abandoned her. He had built a wall around her inheritance, not to punish her, but to protect her until time exposed character and hardship shaped judgment. Grace's vision blurred again. He wrote that he knew she would one day become a mother, and that motherhood would teach her a kind of strength that could not be inherited, purchased, or rehearsed. He said the trust was structured so that when she finally stood at the crossroads of pain and responsibility, she would not merely receive wealth, she would understand what to do with it. Then came the line that broke her completely. If the man beside you at that time is worthy, he will stand. If he is not, let his absence teach you what my presence failed to. Grace lowered the letter. A sound escaped her, not quite a sob, not quite a cry, but something deep and wounded and ancient, as if years of misunderstanding had finally found an opening in her chest. She pressed the paper to her lips, then to her forehead, bowing over Faith until tears fell onto the baby's wrapper. All this time she had believed herself twice rejected. First by her father, then by Ethan. But the first wound had not been what she thought. Beneath the hardness, beneath the silence, beneath the terrible distance that had shaped her adult life, Richard Lawson had still been watching, still planning, still preparing a future for her with the only language he seemed to know, structure, law, and guarded provision. It did not erase the pain. It did not excuse the years she spent believing herself unwanted, but it changed the meaning of her past. Daniel waited until her breathing steadied. "There is more," he said gently. Grace wiped her face and looked up. He opened the file and removed several documents, arranging them on the small table with quiet precision. "Your father's protected trust includes properties in Victoria Island and Lekki Phase 1, equity holdings in 2 major development companies, long-term investment accounts, and a reserve fund placed specifically under maternal and child welfare conditions." Grace stared at him as though he had begun speaking another language. Daniel slid one page closer to her. "There is also a standing directive naming you principal beneficiary and your first child secondary heir under the trust. Your daughter's birth triggered the final legal release." Grace looked down at Faith. The same child whose father had left her in labor. The same child she had carried back from the hospital into a leaking room in Mushin. The same child whose tiny body had slept through hunger, heat, darkness, and her mother's tears. Faith had not arrived as a burden. She had arrived as a key. Grace's arms tightened around her daughter. Daniel continued, his tone measured. "Your father also left instructions regarding reputation, predatory claims, and any attempt by outside parties to manipulate you once the estate became active. He was very specific." Grace let out a weak, incredulous laugh through her tears. "That sounds like him." A faint smile touched Daniel's face. "Yes, it does." He handed her another document. "There's one more important matter. Your father appointed me and his former estate manager, Mr. Adeyemi, as transitional trustees until you are ready to assume direct control. Nothing will be forced on you immediately, but the process can begin whenever you decide." Grace looked around the room, the cracked wall, the worn curtain, the kettle on the floor, the notebook filled with Ethan's failures, the old metal box still open on the bed. Everything was exactly where it had been an hour ago, and yet nothing was the same. The room that had felt like the end of her life now felt like a witness to a turning point, a place where sorrow and revelation had met, a place where the daughter of Richard Lawson, abandoned at birth by one man and restored after death by another, was beginning to see herself clearly again. Daniel watched her carefully. "Ms. Lawson, I know this is overwhelming." Grace shook her head faintly, still staring at the letter. "I don't even know what to feel first." "That is understandable." She looked up. "Why didn't he tell me?" Daniel took a breath before answering. "Because he was a proud man who mistook control for protection, and because by the time he wanted to soften, his health was failing faster than he admitted. He believed the trust and this letter would one day say what he could not say well in person." Grace closed her eyes. For years she had carried anger toward a dead father and longing toward a weak man. Now one grief was changing shape, while the other stood exposed for what it had always been. When she opened her eyes again, something quieter had entered her expression. Not joy, not yet, but foundation. "What happens now?" she asked. Daniel straightened the papers. "Now you breathe. Then, when you are ready, I take you to see what your father left behind." Grace looked down at Faith, whose tiny fingers had curled against her blouse in sleep. The child shifted, sighed, and settled. Grace bent and kissed her forehead with a tenderness sharpened by wonder. Outside, evening noise drifted through Mushin as usual. Vendors calling, generators coughing to life, distant voices rising and falling in ordinary survival. But inside that small room, a different future had quietly begun. And for the first time since the night of the storm, Grace did not feel abandoned by destiny. Grace did not sleep much that night. Even after Daniel Reed left, even after the compound settled into its usual uneven quiet of generators, barking dogs, distant laughter, and babies crying through thin walls. Sleep would not come. Faith slept beside her, one tiny hand flung upward as if claiming space in a world that had not welcomed her gently. But Grace remained awake, propped against the wall, her father's letter resting in her lap, like something sacred and dangerous. She read it 3 more times before dawn. Each time, different words reached her. My dear Grace, if the man beside you is worthy, he will stand. Motherhood will teach you a strength that cannot be inherited. By morning, her tears had changed texture. They were no longer the helpless tears of the hospital or the defeated tears of her first nights back in Mushin. These were quieter, more searching. The tears of a woman standing between 2 truths at once. The life she had been forced to endure, and the life that had been waiting for her all along. Daniel returned just after 10 o'clock in a dark sedan, more practical and flashy. He stepped out in a light gray suit that seemed too orderly for the dust and noise of Mushin, yet he wore the place with respectful calm. He greeted Lydia, who had arrived early and reacted to the entire inheritance revelation, with a full minute of stunned silence, followed by, Grace, if this is a dream, nobody should wake us. Grace almost smiled. She dressed simply, a cream blouse, a long navy skirt, flat sandals, and a soft scarf tied back from her face. She carried Faith herself. No drama, no sudden glamour, no borrowed luxury. But something in her posture had shifted. As Daniel opened the car door for her, Grace turned to look once at the building behind her, the peeling paint, the narrow staircase, the window where heat and grief had watched her for weeks. Mushin had seen her bleed, cry, feed a newborn by torchlight, bargain with fear, and begin writing her pain down in a notebook no one else valued. It had held her when she had nowhere else to fall. She would not forget that. The drive out of Mushin felt unreal. Lagos unfolded in layers around them. Danfo buses forcing their way through traffic, Kiki riders arguing with conductors, women selling plantain chips between lanes, billboards smiling down at a city too busy to notice heartbreak unless it became spectacle. Grace sat by the window with Faith asleep in her arms while Daniel explained details in a voice as steady as a metronome. The first property we're visiting is in Victoria Island, he said. Commercial and residential mixed use. Your father kept a private office suite there. Grace turned toward him. He still kept an office for me? Daniel nodded once. He never stopped preparing space for your return. The words landed so softly that they hurt. When they crossed into Victoria Island, the city seemed to change tone. Roads widened. Buildings rose cleaner and colder. Security gates stood polished and guarded. Trees appeared manicured instead of accidental. Grace knew this Lagos. She had once moved through parts of it as Richard Lawson's daughter, though never freely. Now it looked at once familiar and distant, like a language she had not spoken in years. The building Daniel took her to was glass-fronted and elegant, with a discreet nameplate and a guarded entrance. A uniformed security man opened the gate immediately when he saw Daniel. Inside, air conditioning cooled the lobby to a silence that felt almost unnatural after Mushin. Grace tightened her hold on Faith. A receptionist looked up, then froze for the briefest second. Not because she recognized Grace personally, but because Daniel's expression made it clear that this was no ordinary visitor. They took a lift to the 6th floor. When the doors opened, Grace stepped into a corridor lined with framed architectural renderings, residential towers, estates, commercial plazas, all projects associated with Richard Lawson's company. At the far end was a wooden door with a brushed brass plate. Executive Trustee Suite. Daniel opened it. The office inside was spacious without being gaudy. Dark wood shelves, cream walls, a wide desk facing floor-to-ceiling windows, a seating area arranged with severe elegance. On one wall hung a portrait of Richard Lawson, older, commanding, unsmiling. Grace stopped at the threshold. She had not seen his face that large since the funeral. Her throat tightened. It was preserved exactly as he requested, Daniel said quietly. No changes. Grace stepped in slowly, as though entering a room where memory might still breathe. Her eyes moved across the desk, the files, the fountain pen placed neatly in its holder, the framed certificate from years ago, the leather chair that remained slightly pushed back as if he had only just risen from it. Then she saw something that shook her more than the portrait. On the shelf behind the desk sat a small silver frame containing the same photograph she had found in the metal box. The younger Grace beside her father, his hand on her shoulder. He had kept it here. All this time. Grace crossed the room in silence and touched the edge of the frame with trembling fingers. Faith stirred lightly against her chest, then settled again. Grace looked from the photograph to the portrait of her father and felt grief move through her like a tide, less jagged now, but deeper. He was difficult, Daniel said from a respectful distance, but he was never indifferent. Grace closed her eyes for a second. That was the tragedy of some parents, she thought. They loved deeply, but so poorly that the child mistook the wound for the absence of love. Daniel allowed the silence to stand before leading her into the next part of the visit. He showed her ledgers, trust structures, property schedules, and shared documents, explaining each one with patient clarity. She did not understand everything at once, but she listened. Not like a frightened girl being handed numbers too large to imagine, but like a woman realizing she must become fluent in the language that had once excluded her. By noon, they drove to Lecky Phase 1. The residence there was not a flamboyant mansion, but a refined, secure property tucked behind high cream walls and trimmed hedges. The gate opened automatically. Inside was a wide driveway, a small fountain, a carefully kept lawn, and a two-story house with long windows and soft, earth-toned stonework. Grace stood beside the car for a moment, unable to move. This is one of the trust residences, Daniel said. Your father intended it for private family use. Family? The word nearly undid her. Mr. Adeyemi came out to receive them, a silver-haired man in his 60s, neatly dressed, with the quiet humility of someone who had served power long enough to stop being impressed by it. The moment he saw Grace, his eyes reddened. "Miss Grace," he said, bowing his head slightly. "You have your mother's face when you're trying not to cry." That was it. Grace laughed once through sudden tears, and Mr. Adeyemi looked away for a second, giving her dignity inside the pain. He greeted baby Faith like an awaited child, not a burden, and led them into the house. The interior was warm rather than flashy. Polished floors, cream sofas, bookshelves, soft lighting, fresh flowers in the hallway, and a nursery room that had never been used but had been kept ready with almost eerie foresight. Grace stopped in its doorway and stared at the empty crib, the pale curtains, the folded blankets, the rocking chair by the window. Her father had prepared for a child he would never meet, a child whose birth had unlocked everything. She looked down at Faith, sleeping peacefully against her, and a tremor passed through her body. This was not just inheritance. It was evidence. Evidence that somewhere beneath Richard Lawson's hardness, hope had survived longer than his pride. Later, standing by the upstairs window while the afternoon sun washed gold over the Lecky street, Grace watched Faith sleeping in the crib for the first time and felt two worlds colliding inside her. One was the leaking room in Mushin, where survival had to be earned hour by hour. The other was this quiet house, where future seemed to sit waiting in every room. Daniel came to stand nearby, leaving a respectful space between them. "You don't have to decide everything today," he said. Grace kept her eyes on the crib. "No, but I do have to decide who I become next." Daniel regarded her for a moment. "That," he said, "is the one decision your father could never make for you." Grace turned toward the window again. Outside, Lecky gleamed with all the polished confidence of wealth. Inside, her daughter breathed softly in a room prepared before she was born. And somewhere between past injury and new responsibility, Grace felt the first clear outline of a woman she had not yet fully met, but would. She was no longer just surviving what had been done to her. She was beginning to enter what had been kept for her. Grace did not move into the Lecky house immediately. That surprised Lydia, amused Daniel, and quietly pleased something deep inside her own conscience. The old Grace might once have mistaken luxury for healing, but the woman labor had carved into being understood that a new address could not do the work of a rebuilt soul. So for a few more weeks she moved carefully between Mushin and Lecky, learning before possessing, observing before settling, letting the reality of her father's hidden world become something she could stand inside without feeling like an intruder. Each day brought a new education. Daniel sat with her over documents at the Victoria Island office, explaining the structure of trusts, assets, board control, liabilities, and inheritance law until the language that once sounded cold began to reveal its hidden mercy. Mr. Adeyemi walked her through property histories, tenant issues, development files, and old project maps, telling stories of how her father negotiated land deals and read men faster than contracts. Grace listened with baby Faith near her, sometimes asleep in a carry cot, sometimes awake and blinking at a world being restored around her. She asked questions. She took notes. She refused to pretend knowledge she did not have. And slowly those around her began to notice that she was not merely a beneficiary. She was learning to become a steward. When she finally moved into the Lecky residence, it was done quietly. No party, no public announcement. Lydia came with 2 suitcases, a kettle, baby clothes, and enough commentary to fill the empty halls with laughter. Faith's small things were placed carefully in the nursery her grandfather had prepared. Grace stood in the doorway afterward and let the sight settle into her, not as compensation, but as calling. She also made a decision that startled Daniel. "I don't want this story to end with me just being comfortable," she told him one evening, as they reviewed account summaries in the study. "Pain should not only produce survival, it should produce meaning." Daniel set down his pen. "What are you thinking?" Grace looked toward the nursery where Faith slept. "A support initiative for women abandoned during pregnancy, emergency care, legal guidance, temporary shelter, baby supplies, referrals, not charity that humiliates people, structure that restores them." For the first time, Daniel smiled without restraint. "Your father would have called that expensive sentiment." Grace's lips curved faintly. "Then I'm glad one of us grew past him." The Faith House Initiative began as a concept on paper, then a set of meetings, then a vision strong enough to gather people. Nurses, a women's health advocate, a small legal team Daniel trusted, an accountant, a social worker from Surulere. Grace sat through every discussion, not as a figurehead, but as a woman who remembered the smell of antiseptic, the blank father line on a hospital form, and the weight of carrying a newborn into uncertainty. News of her presence in certain circles began quietly. At first it was whispers in Victoria Island offices, then mentions at private meetings, then puzzled conversations in Ikoyi drawing rooms. "Richard Lawson's daughter is back." The one everyone thought was gone. And she has a child. And apparently she's in control. The first time Ethan heard her name again, it was in a boardroom after a property discussion, connected to one of the Lawson entities. He went still. By evening, Margaret had already called him, voice cold with disbelief. "Tell me it isn't true," she demanded. But it was. The woman they had left in pain had not disappeared into shame. Lagos, which rarely pauses for private sorrow, was beginning to do what it only does for power, mystery, and quiet resilience. It was beginning to pay attention. And Grace, standing by the nursery window that night with Faith in her arms and the city lights blinking beyond Lecky's walls, understood something with sudden clarity. She did not need Lagos to love her, but she was no longer going to let it overlook her. The first time Margaret Cole came to Grace's Lecky residence, she arrived in a pearl-white SUV with the kind of silence that wealthy people mistake for dignity. Ethan sat beside her. Grace watched them through the living room window before the gate fully opened. She had been in the study, reviewing early Faith House budget notes, when the intercom announced their names. For one brief moment, her stomach tightened with an old instinct, the instinct to brace for humiliation. But the feeling passed almost as quickly as it came. This was not Yaba General Hospital. This was not Mushin. And she was no longer a woman waiting to be chosen. Daniel, who happened to be there for a trustees' meeting, looked at her once. "You don't have to do this today." Grace straightened the file in her hand. "Yes," she said quietly. "I do." Margaret entered first, dressed in soft gold silk, every detail of her appearance controlled down to the angle of her handbag. Ethan followed in a dark suit, handsome in the way weak men often are, polished enough to hide rot at a distance. Vanessa joined them minutes later, composed and elegant, her expression carefully neutral, though her eyes moved through the house with unmistakable assessment. Grace received them in the sitting room with calm that unsettled them more than anger would have. No raised voice, no bitterness spilling out, no desperation. Tea was offered. Margaret declined. Ethan remained standing. Vanessa sat only after Grace did. For a few moments, conversation moved in brittle circles. Health, the baby, how unfortunate things had become. Then Margaret leaned forward slightly and dropped the polished mask. "We are here," she said, "because whatever happened before, there is still a child involved, and children should be raised properly." Grace held her gaze. "Properly?" Margaret nodded. "With structure, with name, with family. Whatever misunderstanding you had with Ethan should not destroy Faith's future." There it was. Not remorse, not truth. Control dressed as concern. Ethan finally spoke. "Grace, I know I failed you. I know that. But we can still handle this maturely. I want to be part of my daughter's life." Grace set her cup down gently. "You wanted to be absent when I needed you most. Now you want to be present on convenient terms." Vanessa shifted slightly but said nothing. Margaret's voice cooled further. "This bitterness helps no one." Grace almost smiled. "What you call bitterness is memory." Daniel, seated quietly to one side, said nothing yet. He did not need to. His presence alone reminded the room that this conversation had witnesses, structure, and consequence. Then Margaret made the mistake that hardened the air completely. "It may be best," she said, "for Faith to spend time under our supervision. She deserves the Cole name, the Cole environment, and the advantages of being raised where she belongs." Grace went still. When she spoke, her voice was low enough to make everyone lean in. "Where she belongs?" Margaret lifted her chin. "You know what I mean." "Yes," Grace said. "I do." She rose, crossed to the side table, and returned with a neat folder. When she placed it before them, Ethan's face changed. He recognized seriousness when it wore paper. Inside were copies of hospital time logs, unanswered call records, screenshots, messages, Ethan's first shallow visit, and notes documenting every relevant detail from the night he walked away to the day he returned asking for silence. Grace looked at Ethan, not Margaret. "You did not lose me because I became wealthy," she said. "You lost me the night you decided my pain was inconvenient." The words landed with surgical precision. Ethan lowered his eyes. Vanessa's composure cracked first. She looked at Ethan, then at Margaret, and for the first time seemed to understand that what had been explained to her as complicated was, in fact, cowardice. Margaret closed the folder without reading further. "This is unnecessary drama." "No," Daniel said at last, calm and firm. "This is the documentation." Silence filled the room. Grace stood with the stillness she had earned. Faith is not a family repair project. She is not a surname to be reclaimed when public perception shifts. She is my daughter, and no one who treated her arrival with shame gets to define her future. Margaret rose, furious beneath elegance. Ethan followed more slowly, looking like a man who had finally met the full shape of what he had done and found it unbearable. At the door he turned as if to speak. Grace did not give him the mercy of waiting. They left with less dignity than they arrived with. And when the gate closed behind them, the house grew quiet again. But it was a different quiet now, not the silence of abandonment. The silence of a boundary finally spoken aloud. Margaret Cole did not accept defeat quietly. People like her rarely did. They were too accustomed to influence, opening doors, cleaning records, softening scandal, and bending discomfort into acceptable language. So when Grace refused to hand over Faith to the same family that had treated her birth like a disgrace, Margaret did what power often does when denied privately. She moved the battle into formal spaces. The legal papers arrived on a warm Thursday morning. Grace was in the nursery, folding Faith's tiny clothes into neat stacks, when Daniel came upstairs with the envelope in his hand. One look at his face told her it was no ordinary correspondence. He did not dramatize it. He simply placed it on the table near the rocking chair and said, "Ethan has filed for legal recognition and structured access. Margaret is behind it." Grace did not touch the papers immediately. Faith lay in the crib, half awake, making soft sounds to herself, unaware that adults were once again trying to rearrange her life according to their pride. Grace watched her for a moment and felt the old anger rise, but it was no longer the helpless anger of the hospital bed. It was cleaner now, sharper, guided by truth. "What exactly are they asking for?" she asked. Daniel adjusted his glasses. Recognition, visitation, influence over upbringing, and language suggesting that the child's long-term welfare requires stronger family alignment. He paused. "The wording is polished. The motive is not." Grace let out a slow breath. She had known this might come. The entitlement in Margaret's voice during the Lecky visit had carried the smell of unfinished war. But knowing a storm may come and hearing the first thunder are never quite the same thing. That evening, Grace sat alone in the study after Faith had fallen asleep. The lights in the house were warm and low. Logos hummed faintly beyond the walls. On the desk before her lay two things: the custody filing from Ethan's side and her father's letter. She read Richard Lawson's words again, especially the line that had already begun shaping her new life. "If the man beside you at that time is worthy, he will stand. If he is not, let his absence teach you what my presence failed to." Grace touched the paper lightly. Ethan's absence had already taught her enough. Now she would make sure the law learned it too. The court hearing drew more attention than Grace wanted. Not public spectacle exactly. but the kind of discreet Lagos interest that feeds quietly on power, family reputation, and the possibility of old money being embarrassed by new truth. By the morning of the hearing, the air outside the courtroom carried that tense, watchful energy particular to legal buildings, people speaking in lowered voices, polished shoes crossing tiled floors, files tucked under arms like shields. Grace wore a simple navy dress and no jewelry beyond small pearl studs. Her hair was neatly tied back. Daniel walked beside her with his usual stillness, and Lydia, sitting behind them later in the courtroom, looked like she was restraining herself from personally fighting everyone on Grace's behalf. Ethan was already there. So was Margaret. Vanessa, notably, was not. That absence told Grace more than any apology could have. Judge Helen Roberts entered with the composed authority of a woman who had seen too many people confuse status with substance. Once proceedings began, the careful language of the filings quickly met the hard edge of fact. Ethan's counsel spoke of paternal rights, legacy, family identity, and the importance of the child knowing both sides of her lineage. It sounded polished, almost noble. Then Daniel rose. He did not perform outrage. He did not beg for sympathy. He laid out a timeline. The night of labor, the unanswered calls, the hospital records, the absence at birth, the social media evidence, the delayed, shallow return, the request for silence. The attempt to control the child's narrative after wealth changed the balance of power. Every fact landed with the weight of a door closing. When Grace was called to speak, the room seemed to lean toward her. She stood, hands steady, voice calm. She spoke of Yaba General Hospital, of labor and fear, of filling out forms alone, of returning to Mushin with a newborn and no support beyond friendship. She spoke not to dramatize pain, but to name it clearly. And when she described seeing Ethan smiling at a family dinner while she lay in a hospital bed with his child, a silence settled over the courtroom that no one could polish away. Judge Roberts looked at Ethan directly. "Did you leave the maternity ward on the night in question?" Ethan swallowed. "Yes, my lord." "Did you return before the child was delivered?" "No, my lord." "Did you provide immediate emotional or physical support in the period following birth?" His answer came smaller. "No, my lord." Grace did not look at him then. She did not need to. The truth had finally learned to speak for itself. When judgment came, it was firm, measured, and devastating in its clarity. The court recognized Ethan's biological connection, but refused to reward neglect with control. Grace was granted full custodial authority. Any future access for Ethan would be structured, limited, and contingent on demonstrated responsibility, consistency, and the child's welfare. Not family ego, not surname politics, not Margaret's preferences. Margaret's face hardened into the kind of stillness that meant her pride was bleeding. Ethan looked as though he had aged years in an hour. Outside the courtroom, reporters did not swarm. This was not that kind of drama, but whispers moved quickly. Through legal corridors and private phones, Lagos had heard enough. That evening, Grace did something she had been planning quietly for weeks. She drove to Yaba General Hospital. Not as a patient, not as a woman begging not to be left, but as the founder of the newly formalized Faith House Initiative. She met with administrators, finalized a maternal emergency support donation, and approved equipment funding for women abandoned during childbirth. When Nurse Bisi saw her in the corridor, she stopped walking altogether. For a second, neither woman spoke. Then the nurse's eyes filled. "You came back," she whispered. Grace looked around the same hospital walls that had once held the worst night of her life. "Yes," she said softly, "but not the same way." Later at sunset, she stood at Echo Atlantic with Faith in her arms. The sea breeze lifted the edge of her scarf. Lagos glittered behind her, loud and ambitious and indifferent as ever. Lydia stood nearby, eating roasted corn and pretending not to cry. Daniel lingered at a respectful distance, speaking on the phone about foundation registration matters. Faith touched Grace's chin with one tiny hand. Grace smiled and kissed her forehead. There, with the water stretching wide and the city shining behind them, she understood that restoration was not simply getting back what others tried to deny you. It was becoming so rooted in truth that their rejection could no longer define your reflection. She held her daughter closer and whispered the promise that would close one chapter and begin another. No one will ever make us feel unwanted again.